And now we're going to talk about something that has actually been in the news, in the health news for years, and that is exercise. And we are doing this with somebody who really has been taking leadership in journalism and health journalism for many years in this country, Judy Foreman. I am so happy to be able to introduce you to her. Aside from being a syndicated columnist, staff writer at the Boston Globe, she's a very prolific author. You may know her from A Nation in Pain, the global the global pain crisis, and of course her latest book, Exercise is Medicine. She's a lecturer at Harvard College and MIT, but I was really thrilled to see that she had won the Peabody Award for a documentary regarding a young woman who was dying of cancer. So there is no one who has seen the healthcare in this country for its crisis and for its benefits, and written about it more than Judy Foreman. So thank you so much, Judy, for being with us today. We really want to hear from you and have you lead the conversation with Dr. Rando later on, and then take tons of questions from our audience.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm giving the longer version of this talk to my fellow alumni from Wellesley College. Dr. Rando will be there. Just a quick note on him. He is a professor of neurology and neurological sciences at Stanford, and he's looking forward very much to coming. So given that we have a short amount of time, I will just plunge right in. This is a short talk. My book is called Exercise is Medicine, and it really is. If you're interested in more than what I can say in 10 or 12 minutes here, you can get the book on Amazon or on my website or directly from Oxford University Press. Anyway, to a scientist, aging is one of the deepest mysteries of the universe. We all think we know what aging is, but actually at a very minute biological level, we don't. In fact, why, these scientists ask, why do some creatures live long, healthy lives and others not? In fact, why is it that some creatures do not age at all? Sea anemones, for instance, and sea urchins are among the more, or what did we say, primitive animals who don't really seem to age. Mathematically, that means their risk of death is the same at any point along their lifespan, whereas with us in general, our risk of dying goes up as time goes by, although interestingly, it's not linear because there is this phenomenon known as the hardy survivor effect. If you make it to 90 in pretty good shape, you're in good shape for a while to come. In fact, why do some species, like humans and other animals like whales and elephants, live way past the age of reproduction? In fact, why do we have a lot of postmenopausal females around in certain species, like us? One explanation, and this is more conjecture than actual proof, but one idea is that there is a so-called grandmother effect. Whoops, let's go back to the grandmother. The idea is that older critters in a tribe or a community actually have knowledge that can be useful for bringing up the next generation. Grandmother elephants and whales, for instance, have knowledge of food supplies, or in the case of elephants, water supplies, essential knowledge that can keep the whole tribe, the whole DNA chain going in times of stress. In fact, this is Michael Rose. He's an evolutionary biologist in California, and he says that taking care of your grandchild is actually a reproductive act. And when you think about it, he's right, because basically the idea is to keep our DNA going, and taking care of your child's child really does that, keeps the family genes going. I actually saw something that shows the value of older people myself back in 1993 when I was a reporter for the Boston Globe. There was an outbreak of a virus called the hantavirus, H-A-N-T-A. And this virus actually, unfortunately by some fellow journalists, not me, dubbed it the Navajo flu because it arose in the Navajo reservation. But the doctors actually had the very good sense, the doctors at the New Mexico Department of Health and the CDC had the very good sense to talk to the Navajo elders about what was going on. And the elders told the doctors that twice before in the 20th century, they had observed a connection between increased rainfall and a bumper crop of pinon nuts, pine nuts. And the excess pine nuts led to a surge in the deer mouse population, which led to a huge surge in deer mouse poop, which got aerosolized and dried, and people breathed it and got pneumonia and died. So having the knowledge of the elders really speeded up the process by which the doctors could figure out what was going on. Two things in general are quite important in terms of determining longevity. One is environment, the other is genes, and the other is, a third one is behavior, obviously. The top slide, I actually took myself a couple years ago. This is a female leopard in Botswana. My husband and I were there on vacation, and I totally recommend it. This young lady is coming out of her tree. It's dusk, you can see by the shadows, and she is doing quite well. She's coming down to kind of forage for her dinner. She obviously blends in very well with the environment, and she lives in what for her is a very safe environment. And the shadows on the bottom are the tourists, including me, taking her picture. On the bottom picture is me looking at 3 rhinos in basically the same area, but for the rhinos, their environment is not safe at all. And the reason is poaching. In fact, the day we saw these 3 rhinos, the day before, 2 rhinos in this group, there were originally 5, got poached and killed. So for them, the environment was not safe. So environment is very important. In recent decades, human life expectancy has gone up in large part because our environments are safer. It's not really antibiotics or modern medicine that has helped our environments be safer. It's really basic things like clean water, clean air, refrigeration to keep food from spoiling, and things like that. I should note that in the last few years, there's been a downward turn in Americans' life expectancy due to what they call diseases of despair, like addiction, alcoholism, suicide. But I think that's beginning to tick in the good direction again. But we can see that this life expectancy has really been changing as the at the age of a woman's birth of her first child goes up. Women overall are having their babies later than they used to. On average, the birth of a woman's first child is now 26.3 years, and only a few years ago, it was 24.9. That's a huge change in evolutionary terms. So we are doing what is called actually delayed reproduction. One question that evolutionary biologists ask a lot is, could we keep the aging process going forever? The answer is not quite known, but what is known is that a goal that we could all have in mind is what demographers call squaring the curve. On the curvy line that says normative aging, that's basically what happens now. But the goal would be to what they call square the curve, stay healthy for more years of life, and then essentially drop dead. You're compressing morbidity. You're shortening the number of years that a person is in ill health and suffering from disability and disease. And that is a doable goal. And it is achieved in major part, although not solely, by exercise, which is what my book is about. Briefly, what is aging? As I think the previous panel was talking about, and I talk about in my book, there are now known to be about 9 major hallmarks of aging. And these were itemized and discovered for the layman, for general public knowledge in 2013 by a bunch of European scientists. And these processes are epigenetic alterations, genomic instability, telomere attrition, loss of proteostasis, deregulated nutrient sensing, mitochondrial dysfunction, cellular senescence, stem cell exhaustion, and altered intercellular communication. In the longer version of this talk, you would get to hear all about those, but unfortunately we don't have that much time. But these are real processes, and the interesting thing to me is that exercise has a profound and good effect on all of these. The bad news is that our westernized lifestyle of too much food and too little exercise works the opposite way, kind of speeds up these processes. There was an interesting study a few years ago that took muscle biopsies of volunteers who then rode exercise bikes for 45 minutes at a time, 4 times a week for 3 months. But the trick is they only used one leg. They had one leg down on the floor and the other leg pumping away. And what happened was a huge difference in a process called DNA methylation. And if you were listening to the previous session, that's something that Dr. Steve Horvath has studied in great detail. The gist of it is that the pattern of DNA methylation is very different in muscles that are exercised compared to those that are not. And this is Steve, you just saw him. And interestingly, here is a video or a cartoon essentially of what happens. Methyl groups, which are basically just clusters of hydrocarbons, land on different stretches of DNA and either turn a gene on or turn it off. This is essentially part of what Steve Horvath calls the epigenetic clock. And epigenetics, in case you've forgotten, is a process by which there are changes to the DNA, sort of by outside factors, not changes in the DNA structure itself. Changes in the DNA itself, those are called mutations. These are kind of outside forces acting on the DNA. This is a little picture of what happens. Okay. Interestingly, Steve and others have found that some parts of the body actually age faster than others. For instance, the heart can be 50 years old, while the lungs can be the equivalent of 30. Interestingly, also, men tend to age faster than women, and some ethnic groups age faster than others. So this is a very interesting process, and he is one of the leaders in looking at this. One of the other hallmarks of aging, which you may have heard of, is called telomere attrition. Telomeres, in case you have forgotten that, are little chunks of DNA at the ends of chromosomes, sort of like the aglets, those little plastic things at the end of shoelaces. And like these plastic tips on shoelaces, the job of telomeres is to keep the rest of the chromosome from unraveling in the wrong way so that the cell can divide properly. When we're born with nice, long, healthy telomeres. And as a process of aging, as the years go by, our telomeres get shorter and shorter. Obviously, this means that you could measure the length of telomeres and possibly get a sense of how old that person was. This is an extremely controversial hypothesis that many very good scientists dispute and other good ones really hold to. The other controversial thing about telomeres is whether exercise helps keep them long and healthy or not. And this is a very open-ended area of the research. One of the other hallmarks of aging involves genomic instability. As we age, little chunks of DNA, which are officially called transposons and colloquially called jumping genes, move around, hop from one part of the DNA to another. This is not a good thing. It creates some instability in the genome, but it's also useful as a way to measure a person or a being's age. There are a lot of other mechanisms that I go to in the book and in the other talk, but I can't now. But interestingly, it wasn't always obvious that exercise can extend both the health span and the lifespan. But it's now known without any doubt. And as a medical writer, I have to say for 20, 30 years, I can't even remember. Most of the things you write about are on the one hand, on the other hand. This vaccine works, this vaccine doesn't work, this drug works, this doesn't. With exercise, the data really lines up in a delightfully clear way. Exercise is a very powerful way to lower the risk of heart disease, some cancers. It can help prevent diabetes. It definitely improves brain function. I'll come back to this in a minute. It spurs hormones that can dampen chronic inflammation, which is a major culprit for the problems in later life. And it reduces all-cause mortality. In 1953, a British epidemiologist, Jeremy Morris, provided the first compelling evidence of the effect of exercise on health and longevity. He compared conductors in these London double-decker buses with the drivers, and the conductors were running around all day collecting tickets, and the drivers just sat there. And it turned out that the conductors had far superior cardiac health, and a slew of follow-up studies found the same thing. In fact, there are just so many data showing the benefits of exercise for longevity that it's totally clear-cut. One of my favorite studies was in 2008, and this is when German researchers did a massive meta-analysis of 33 studies involving 883 adults. A meta-analysis, in case you've forgotten, is when researchers pool the results of a whole bunch of studies using the same variables in each study, so they get a much more statistically significant, it's more statistically powerful. And overall, they found that physical activity results in 35% fewer heart disease deaths and 33% less all-cause mortality. It doesn't take that much exercise to get this benefit. You don't have to be a marathon runner, although that's great. It only takes, 30 minutes a day for 5 days a week. That's the government recommendation. And on this, unlike the current CDC, this recommendation is pretty solid. The bare minimum, according to the government, is 150 minutes per week of moderate exercise. As I said, 30 minutes a day for 5 days. And moderate means you're breathing a little bit hard, but you can still talk, but you can't sing. One of the reasons exercise has such a big effect on longevity is because it has beneficial effects for the heart. This is Aimin Lee, who I've been talking to for years in for my column and other things. And it's because heart disease is the leading killer of Americans that exercise is so powerful. It's powerful because it can prevent disease on the largest killer. It really helps your heart. And we'll skip the heart diagram. One of the things I learned that I found most interesting was that while traditional aerobic activity is great, running for half an hour or longer, high intensity interval training is even better. It's exceptionally good for cardiovascular fitness. There are a number of protocols, and you can find them on the web. Just look up HIIT, high intensity interval training. The earliest and one of the most famous still is called the Wingate protocol, developed in the 70s by Israelis. And you do a 30-second absolute killer fast, intense workout, and then 4 minutes of recovery. People do all sorts of variations. I do a minute fast, a minute slow, a minute fast, a minute slow, till I've gotten to 32 minutes. But people do this, and it has very good effects on the heart. A lot of people question whether there could be too much of a good thing in terms of exercise, and the answer is very, very, very rarely. There was one study of Rhode Island joggers, for instance, that found that there was one death during jogging for every 400,000 man hours, and this study was all men, of jogging. Another study of physicians found only one death for every 1.42 million episodes of exercise. Even for people in cardiac rehab, these are people who've already had a heart attack, the death rate during exercise is only one death per 60,000 participant hours. So the risk of dying from exercise is very, very low. I know I'm using up too much time, so I'll quickly say that evolution endowed us with mitochondria, which arose 1.5 billion years ago as a bacterium that had a special trick. It could use oxygen to combine with food to make energy. And because our cells now have these mitochondria, this is what happens with us. It's a little bit of a complex process. It's called the electron transport chain. And the net result, if you watch the lower right corner, is ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And that is essentially the energy molecule. It's incredibly important for our functioning. And exercise revs up mitochondria. In fact, exercise through a chemical made in the body called PGC1 alpha, which was actually discovered by one of the Harvard scientists here, Bruce Spiegelman. Exercise mass produces mitochondria. And the interesting thing is, just as with the DNA methylation in the people who bike with only one leg, exercise only revs up the mitochondria in the muscles you use. Okay, quickly on the brain, if just feeling fit and thin and good doesn't work for you, exercise for your brain. Exercise triggers production in the brain of a chemical called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, meaning it's a factor, it's a chemical that's made in the brain in response to exercise. One scientist I know has dubbed this miracle grow for the brain, and that's an easier way to remember it. When you exercise, your brain pumps out this BDNF, this miracle grow, and a number of studies show that this is really helpful in preventing and treating depression. In fact, it can be as good for many people as the drugs. So a treatment and a preventive is exercise because of this chemical BDNF. Exercise also has a powerful effect on improving cognition and reducing the risk of Alzheimer's. In fact, the data show that lack of exercise is the #1 modifiable risk factor for preventing Alzheimer's. In fact, a Canadian study showed that if everyone who is currently inactive suddenly became active at just the minimum recommended levels, 1 in every 7 cases of Alzheimer's could be prevented. So basically, how much exercise is enough? I already mentioned that, 150 minutes a week. Here's a killer slide. We lose fitness incredibly fast. Aerobic conditioning declines by 25% after just 3 or 4 weeks of not doing anything. And even 2 weeks can lead to a significant decline. It does come back. There's basically no harmful level for most people for doing exercise. In fact, a study of 661 people found that even at 10 times the recommended dose of exercise, there was no evidence of harm. Obviously, if you're worried, you have heart disease, you have cancer, you have diabetes, something else, check with your doctor. Hopefully your doctor will know the answer. So I'm going to close with a picture that I took in Provincetown, which is near where I go in the summer. This woman was in a wheelchair 4 years ago, and here she is. Okay, there we go. So I think Dr. Rando is here, right?
I do want you to know.
Huh?
I want you to know that your book is definitely on our platform. People can actually go to our platform and go directly to Amazon. And we thank you so much. And we hope that your good words get out to the public, because knowing that exercise is important is different than doing the exercises.
Right. I'm happy to stay on until 2:30.
Dr. Rando, if we can have Dr. Rando on right now.
Great. My screen is on. Do you have me?
Yes.
And you have my slides?
We see it. We're back in business. No problem at all.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, thanks so much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Tough act to follow. Judy has a very broad view, of course, of aging and longevity and exercise. What I'll talk about today is some work from our lab, and we'll get down a little bit into the weeds, and I'll try not to get too much detail, but really covering the idea of exercise and aging. We really come at this from the perspective of stem cells. And by stem cells, I mean those cells that are really throughout the body involved in repairing tissues. And so we'll talk about a little bit on aging, get into exercise, and then come back to aging. Won't talk much about metabolism or obesity, but obviously they're all related. So these are some of my disclosures, just corporate ventures I'm involved with. So in my lab, we study primarily skeletal muscle, which of course is highly relevant to any talk of exercise. But what we really study not only is the aging of muscle, we all lose muscle as we get older, but we study the repair process, meaning in an injury, you have a repair process as in many tissues in the body. And that's just illustrated here, which is a illustration of skeletal muscle from a mouse, but you see the same thing in humans. Above, you see a normal skeletal muscle. This is an injury, and it's clearly disrupted that normal architecture. And over the course of a few days and a few weeks, that architecture completely repairs. So really, there's this remarkable regenerative potential of skeletal muscle, as there is for many other cells in the body. So this propensity to repair is based on the presence of these few rare stem cells in the muscle. And this is an electron micrograph of one of these stem cells shown here, a little cell sitting next to this very large muscle fiber below. So this cell has remarkable, in a way regenerative and in a way rejuvenative potential, making an old tissue, making tissue repair as it was before. But as we know, as we get older, our ability to repair tissues declines. So whether it's a skin wound or a bone fracture, in this young fellow, we'll repair very quickly without a scar, whereas the older we get, our reparative processes decline. And there's this kind of decline in stem cell functionality. Judy mentioned stem cell exhaustion as one of the hallmarks of aging. We really studied the functional decline of these cells, and this is just illustrated here from a young mouse or an old mouse. After one injury or a second injury or multiple injuries, a young mouse recovers very well. But in an old mouse, you start to see these little areas of fibrosis and impaired tissue response. So you don't have to be a pathologist to kind of recognize this looks much more disrupted than this. So old tissues just seem to repair poorly. So we were very interested in this kind of aging phenomenon many years ago, now almost 20 years ago, that led us to this very strange experiment called parabiosis, where we connected two mice together. And so the tissues of one animal are exposed to the circulating environment in the blood of the other animal. And so these are the kind of the so-called control pairs, young mice connected to young mice, old mice connected to old mice. But the interesting pairs are these, the so-called heterochronic, different age mice. So a young mouse connected to an old mouse. And the question we had in mind, for reasons that I won't go into, is when an old tissue is exposed to blood from a young animal, what happens to it? Does it change the way the stem cells in those tissues respond? And in fact, it was really quite remarkable. So if we look at these young control pairs, they repair very well. We start to see this scarring I was talking about in the old pairs. But in these heterochronic pairs, the old muscles, if we injure them, now look young again. Okay, so this was really a remarkable transition for us to start thinking about, can we rejuvenate old tissues to become young? And we published a couple of papers in the early 2000s. We collaborated with a colleague at Stanford, Tony Weiss-Corey, to look at the brain, saw the same kind of effect. And many other tissues have shown the same response, which is when exposed to young blood, old tissues now acquire a more youthful kind of characteristic. Okay, so we can't parabiose people. So are there more practical ways that we can apply this kind of approach to making old tissues young? And this idea goes way back. So Hippocrates recognized that exercise alone can be a very potent geroprotective, for using a word in this conference. And interesting, he mentions eating. You know, I think when you study aging in cells, you end up either studying diet or exercise, one or the other. We study both, but I'll talk about exercise today. So I'm a marathon runner, so I was very encouraged by this article in the New York Times a few years ago, which says an hour of running may add 7 hours to your life. So I like that math because I can just keep running, and that's a very good formula for me. But we were really encouraged by work that came out of the Salk Institute from Rusty Gage's lab many years ago, showing that exercise, and this relates also to something Judy mentioned, is one of the most potent inducers of neural stem cell activity. So these few neural stem cells in the brain that are responsible for learning and memory are remarkably stimulated by exercise. So we asked the same kind of question, which is, does exercise rejuvenate muscle stem cells in old mice? Same thing. Is there something beneficial about exercise to these old stem cells that seem to be repairing poorly, but then with this young blood can repair better? Well, this is work from a MD PhD student in the lab and a postdoc in the lab who asked this question: if we put mice on a running wheel for 3 weeks and then we injure the muscle, does it repair better in these old mice than it did without the exercise? So I won't go into a lot of the technical details, but this is an index of muscle repair. Here's from young animals and old animals, and you can see it declines with age. Exercise, interestingly, has no benefit, at least in this experiment, to the stem cells from young animals, but markedly improves the reparative properties of old tissues. So we looked at across the whole genome. We asked what genes are expressed, number one, that go down with age and that are increased with exercise. And we came across this one gene, Cyclin D1, which was quite a surprise to us because that's usually involved in a cell division process. But it was very robust, and this gene is highly induced with exercise. So we made some mice that genetically are either normal, so-called wild type, meaning they have 2 copies of the Cyclin D1 gene. They're heterozygous, they have 1 copy of the Cyclin D1 gene, or they're knockouts, so they have no copies of the Cyclin D1 gene. And interestingly, when we looked at these mice, The amount of this Cyclin D1 is normal in the wild type, about half in the heterozygous, and completely gone in the knockout. And we look at stem cell function, which is shown over here. Again, this is the wild type level, reduced in the heterozygous and reduced further in the knockout. So clearly, this gene seems to be important in regulating the biology of these stem cells. Now, what about exercise? So if we look at these mice with one copy of the Cyclin D1 gene, here's the wild type level. Well, exercise restores both Cyclin D1 expression and stem cell function in these mice with one copy. In the mice with no copies, of course, there's no expression of the gene, and exercise has no benefit. Okay, so this is our kind of graphical abstract. I'll end with here, and then just a couple of slides for food for thought. So here you have a young animal, has high levels of Cyclin D1 in its muscle stem cells, which leads to normal repair in response to injury. With age, Cyclin D1 goes down in these stem cells. It impacts other signaling pathways and leads to impaired tissue response. But exercise can make these animals essentially behave younger by enhancing their stem cell function. Okay, so let me just leave with two other slides for, again, food for thought. So first of all, and this Judy mentioned, of course, exercise the effect is transient. So if we look at these mice that have exercised for 3 weeks, and we look at their stem cell function right after exercise, 1 week later or 2 weeks later, that benefit goes away in a couple of weeks. So we all know that when we stop training, we lose that functionality. But what's really interesting is I think this slide. So I'll end with this as our last data slide, is if we exercise old mice, we take their blood and we give them to old mice that have not exercised, we can see a marked improvement in stem cell function. So when we think about exercise and muscle, we think the effect is from the contraction of the muscle. But this says that at least some of this is from what gets secreted into the blood and then feeds back to the muscle. And what's in the blood may also be what goes to the brain, at least to enhance neurostem cell function, or to other parts of the body, enhance cardiovascular fitness. So through this kind of experiment, we can not only understand the benefits of exercise, but we get a sense that there's actually some blood-borne factors that are mediating this remarkable beneficial effect. So is this really rejuvenation? I mean, these old cells now look young and they behave young. And if we look at their molecular properties, they look younger. But really, we're working on this right now. And again, this relates to the previous session on epigenetic clocks, but many other ways of looking at what is the age of a cell. Can we determine an old cell becoming a young cell? And can we have these kind of molecular readouts that tell us we're actually reversing the aging process? We're not just making old cells work better, we're actually making them more youthful. And I think that's kind of the holy grail in the field. That's kind of a major focus of our work. And I'll just end by thanking my group. These are the two people I mentioned who really led this study. They were helped by other people in the lab and some former members, our collaborator from Stanford, who we work on a lot of exercise and aging with. And then I'd like to thank my the support we received for doing this kind of work. So I will end there, and I will happy to turn this over to a kind of Q&A session.
Thank you,
And I'll stop sharing.
Several questions, and I was very surprised to see the first three, because both for Judy, if she's still on, I think I just saw a peek at Dr. Rando. 3 questions that were negative about exercise. And they all had to do one way or the other about the rejuvenation of tissues once they're torn and muscles once they're torn. And one asked, what about somebody who rips a ligament? Over and over again, 3 questions on that. So how regenerative are we when we get injured during an exercise? Either one who would like to take that.
So I think Judy's off. So
Go ahead.
apologies to the audience. This is supposed to be a panel. I think you're stuck with me.
Not at all.
I'll do my best.
I'll
do my best to answer the questions. So it's a very good question. So the challenge here is this: is that when we get injured in a athletic endeavor, competitive sport, even running, typically the injury, let's say a muscle, involves both the muscle and the tendon. Okay, now. Muscle, as I was just talking about, repairs very well. Tendon repairs very poorly. Other tissues in the body, like cartilage, why do we lose cartilage in our knees and it doesn't regenerate? Wouldn't it be great if cartilage regenerated? We would basically, we would not have osteoarthritis, but we do. So certain tissues are very poor at regenerating. And if you have a combined muscle tendon injury, which is very common in sports, the muscle will heal, but the tendon will not, or it will heal poorly. So you can be left with kind of a slightly impaired and prone to a second injury because of that. So it's a good question.
Second question, we have had somebody a few times explain the importance of medicine to the brain, and that even as Judy said, Alzheimer's, one of the indicators is a sedentary life. But once you do have a morbidity or a comorbidity, and if it is Alzheimer's, is there a prescriptive type of exercise? Should one reduce the amount of exercise? And then I want to get to the question everybody's asking, which is, with this young blood, how do we translate that into something more realistic for the public? But first, with regard to prescriptive exercise, or exercise as a prescription.
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, there have been no controlled studies showing, I'm not an expert in this, so I should probably not go too far, but you know, most of the data on the benefits of exercise in preventing disease is epidemiological, which means, you know, it's not prospective. It's not as if you take a group of people and exercise this group and don't this group and see who gets Alzheimer's disease. It's retrospective, primarily saying there's an association of an active lifestyle with the incidence later in life of Alzheimer's disease. I am not aware of any prescriptive exercise protocol, whether it's resistance exercise or aerobic exercise, that can be used as a therapeutic in the setting of active Alzheimer's disease, for example, or any kind of neurodegenerative disease. So I think that, you know, that's kind of a future prospect. Right now, we're looking at more of a lifestyle change throughout life that leads to a reduction in susceptibility to Alzheimer's disease, delayed onset or something like that.
We're going to have Zan has a wonderful follow-up question, but after that, we do need to answer that question of where you see the next steps on this young blood.
Oh, so that, yeah, sorry. So
well,
you know, that's
actually,
obviously.
Well, first, Tom, thank you very much. Terrific presentation and very intriguing data. On the very interesting finding of passive transfer, what have you done to characterize the humoral factor that's involved?
Yeah, I mean, so that's our $1 million question, right? Can we reduce the complexity of blood to specific proteins or metabolites? So we have just started looking at this in terms of identifying protein factors and metabolites. Actually, that's more of what we're planning to do, to see the benefits of individual components of blood that, number one, change with exercise and can be administered, and see the same effect of transferring, you know, exercise plasma. So we're very early in that stage, but that gets back to the previous question, which is, you know, what if this young blood idea being transferred to an individual and leading to an improvement of age cellular function, whether it's stem cells or other cells. That's been, again, you know, since we published these early work on the parabiosis in the early 2000s, many laboratories have been looking for individual proteins that seem to have this kind of rejuvenating effect. I should mention that the converse is also true. I didn't mention this, but in these parabiotic pairs, the young mice seem to get older. So, you know, there's no free lunch here. So there's, you know, we think there are factors in the old blood that are promoting aging, just as there are factors in the young blood promoting youthfulness. So both have been found, are factors that have these kind of characteristics have both been found in young blood and old blood. And the question really is, can we reduce this to a therapeutic with one factor or several factors? And many factors have been found, but I think, you know, we're still very early in the stage of developing these into therapeutics.
And our final question.
Tom, are you targeting Cyclin D?
So Cyclin D is challenging because of, you know, of its role, its critical role in cell division. And so if we were to target Cyclin D, so we've made a mouse, I should say, that in which we can maintain high levels of Cyclin D or induce them in old animal stem cells. And when we do that, we do restore youthfulness. So in theory, in those cells, if we could induce Cyclin D, we could see the same benefit. The problem is, if we made a pill that did that, we would be inducing Cyclin D in all cells. And there's just such a high risk of cancer, of inducing this gene in particular is involved in cell division. So we would really be looking what we call downstream of cyclin D. So, the cyclin D then affects other proteins in the cell, and those are the ones that we're targeting so as not to screw up the cell cycle machinery.
As a final question, this one is from me personally. We've been talking a lot about rejuvenation and so on. Sarcopenia, I don't know if we have a connection here, but it seems to me that we do. Can you say a word about that?
It's a good question, and it's actually debated in the field. In my opinion, there's not as strong a connection as we would like, which is to say, sarcopenia is the shrinking of muscle with age, essentially. Now, the shrinking of muscle with age is primarily an effect of shrinking of these large muscle fibers, not the few stem cells that are there. As far as we know, these stem cells that are there are not very good at preventing or reversing sarcopenia. The shrinkage of these large fibers seem to be relatively independent of the stem cells that are there, which is unfortunate, because if we could target the stem cells as we do in these injury repairs, and it could have the same benefit in preventing atrophy, I mean, that would be a huge effect, because muscle injury is something that happens to individuals. Everyone gets sarcopenia, everyone. So, it's a major focus of the pharmaceutical industry and has been, but with disappointing results in terms of development of therapeutics. At this point, I would say there's not strong evidence that enhancing stem cell function can prevent or reverse sarcopenia.
Thank you very much. I want to throw this over to Zaya now, because he has
so
great interest in this. He keeps talking about young blood, and he's talking about your work.
I'm an endocrinologist, so can you blame me? But no, we won't keep going down that track. But I know there are a lot of other questions. I know Thomas has some additional questions that he'll bring from the floor. So Thomas, we do have some more time.
Sure.
Keep going.
Zoe Dew has asked, have you looked into the mitochondria morphology or functions change in the conjoined mice muscle?
So that's a good question. We have not. Interestingly, well, let me step back and say, when we conjoin these mice, one of the most interesting things is that the old mice start to look younger just from a distance. Their coat looks better. So there's something very general that's happening. And yet, if we just look at the muscle, we don't injure it, we just look at we don't see many dramatic changes in tissues in response to this parabiosis pairing. But if we injure the tissues, we see a dramatic response. So we have not gone into a lot of detail in terms of digging down into the organelles like mitochondria of muscle fibers to see to look for some kind of enhancement, primarily because we have not seen a dramatic change. And it may just be at the level we've looked. We may just not looked carefully enough at the muscle fibers themselves.
One of the other questions from our attendees is the value of the blood that you're using. In other words, the question really was, if you have an athlete's blood, does it make a difference if you're using that as opposed to just a question of younger blood? What does younger blood actually mean here?
I mean, I have no idea. We've done this in mice. Obviously, now there have been studies done in humans. In fact, speaking of Alzheimer's disease, the early studies, the earliest controlled studies of delivery of young plasma to older individuals was done in patients who had early onset Alzheimer's disease to look for a benefit. Now that was a phase 1 trial. It showed safety. It's progressed to a phase 2-3 trial. So we will know, hopefully, whether administration of when I say young plasma, I mean plasma donated by young people, teenagers or 20-year-old, that then gets transferred. And it's being looked at in a lot of, now quite a few age-related diseases. So we will at least have, I think, some answers as to the value of young blood as transferred into individuals for treatments of diseases. Now, I'm not aware of anything that's been done with athletes' blood, in the same way we did it with the mice in humans.
Let's go ahead. I know you had a question.
No, I was just looking in the chat room, and someone was saying, how about Lance Armstrong's blood? And I don't know whether this is a sort of is it genetic or Schwarzenegger blood will turn you into much better blood? I would imagine it has to be something with, near super centenarian's blood might be something I'm more interested in than some bodybuilder or cyclist. But Tom, I don't know that you have looked into this with data.
We've not looked. I mean, people have certainly obviously looked at centenarian genome and proteome and metabolome to look for, what's special about them. But of course, really the question is, what was special about them throughout their lives that allowed them to live to that age? I mean, at that age, maybe, maybe masked by just the effects of aging, but exactly. Clearly the plateau they were able to keep throughout adult life, it would be wonderful to know if there were secrets from the blood in that kind of longevity.
Have you started to parse the different kinds of exercise, kind you do when you're running a marathon versus weightlifting or some kind of phasic activity that is not involving cardiovascular fitness?
Yeah, that's a great question, simply because there's really good evidence that resistance training, weightlifting essentially, has really profound effects on basically quality of life for older individuals in terms of keeping them active and keeping them mobile. We've not done this in mice primarily because it's very, very difficult to actually develop resistance training models in mice. You can't get them to lift weights. I mean, people have tried to find ways to put weights on their back and have them climb ladders that gives a little bit of what's called load that would mimic much more what the resistance training that people do. So the animal studies have been wanting in terms of resistance exercise. So most of that data comes from humans. And in terms of, rodent studies, we've done mostly only, I would say, aerobic studies. Although we've done different kinds of studies, one with voluntary wheel running, which they run when they want. So, and then there's another kind of test, which is called treadmill running, where we put them on a treadmill that, you go to the gym, that treadmill goes, you've got to run. So that's forced running. So they're quite different in some ways that we see in terms of the benefits to the tissue, but they're both aerobic.
So this may lead to prescriptions for exercise. I know that the NIA is actually looking at that, doing some clinical trials for the possibility of prescribing exercise, because it is medicine.
No doubt. I mean, no doubt. It's just right now, I don't think we have the scientific basis to know what the right answer is, because you have number one, type of exercise, and even within just grossly aerobic versus resistance, even within those, obviously there are different versions. Then there's duration, intensity. So all of these are, if you're a physician, I'm a neurologist, you're doing a prescription, you can't say exercise, you have to say twice a day, this amount of time, it's very specific. And we just, the base of knowledge for knowing what is the prescription is really lacking. I mean, just to mention, there's a multi-million-dollar, multi-center program going on at NIH called MOTRPAC, MOTRPAC, which stands for Molecular Transducers of Physical Activity, which is exactly this question is, we all know this is good for us. What is it about it that's good for us? How do we reduce this kind of generic idea that exercise is good to something we can actually prescribe? Whether it's prescribed at the level of exercise or reduce it further to something that we could, some pill we could take. So this, this is a major, major challenge.
I want to read a question from the chat, but before I do that, further to Zan's question, what sorts of exercise might be helpful? I want to inform the audience that in our title and description of this session, we had Dan Lieberman, who's an evolutionary biologist and cultural anthropologist from Harvard. He unfortunately was waylaid by a topical health issue, but so the idea is he was supposed to bring his evolutionary biology perspective to the geroprotective aspects of exercise. And I'm not doing it any justice, but he said that in our ancestral environment, our ancestors walked 10 miles a day minimum, and they spent their time harvesting or gathering foods or hunting and so forth. And so we are well adapted to using that activity to help us to remain resilient and healthy. He has a new book out that was supposed to be out by now, but was delayed by COVID, the pandemic. So hopefully we can at least virtually tie the themes of this session together that way. Looking at a question from Dylan Dwyer, are there any metabolites specifically that you've identified in blood of exercise or young animals that appear to be inducing the effect? I know that you said you're looking, but you haven't seen something specific. I know that succinate was recently identified as necessary for muscle adaptation. So I don't know if you haven't found anything, or you have some candidates, but you don't want to get ahead of the tips of your skis, or lots of people are looking. What's the status of this search?
Yeah, no, so the questioner is very, very well informed. That's a very recent study on succinate. And that's correct. It was found to be a metabolite that is actually produced in muscle and then feeds back into the muscle to allow it to adapt to a changing environment. So, muscle is very adaptive, and succinate, which is produced like lactate during exercise, appears to have a positive, basically, feedback on the tissue itself. So, that would be the kind of metabolite that we would be looking for in the blood that goes up with exercise. We have not yet, again, we just have not yet found that. We're very interested in succinate from that recent report. I was going to make a comment about evolution. Do you mind if I do, Thomas?
Please.
Okay. So this is not my field, and I actually read. So Dan Lieberman had an article in Harvard Magazine recently that I think is a kind of a synopsis or a little segment from the book. So very, very interesting on this idea that we have evolved to move. Now, we have not evolved to exercise. And I think he makes this point. I'm not sure of this, but I think the correlate of that is if you look across the world at these areas where longevity is prominent, where you have high levels of centenarians, Sardinia, Okinawa, different parts of the world. The one thing that they have in common is they don't exercise. Okay, what I mean by that is they don't go to the gym and exercise. They don't do something they are just physically active all the time. Now, we would not call that exercise, because exercise is this thing that you do for purpose. But what's common in these areas of high longevity is the absence of sedentary behavior. They're farming, they're walking. And so I think that gets into, something that Judy sort of referred to is you don't have to run marathons to get this benefit of, quote, exercise. Really, and I wish Dan were here because I think he would speak, very eloquently on this topic. It's really about physical activity and the absence of what, take full responsibility, as most of us do, sedentary behavior most of the day. If we change our lifestyle, there's I think strong, compelling correlative evidence that that's probably one of the best things that you can do. I often say, we get into these very complex genetic experiments and molecular biology. And at the end of the day, my conclusion is it's what your mother told you: diet and exercise. Everything comes down to eat less and exercise more. I think Dan would probably second that.
Dr. Rando, I had the privilege of having a long conversation with Dr. Lieberman just about that. And I have good news. He's agreed today, even though he does not feel very well. He's going to, in the next couple of weeks, do a podcast for us.
Oh, fantastic.
He suggested on this topic. So I'm going to throw that back then. Functional exercise. This is becoming, as Zan Fleming asked about what kinds of exercise. Well, today we have a new buzzword or trend we call functional exercise, which I always envision is getting out in the garden and digging something, because we're not agrarian anymore and I have to find ways to do that. What's your take on that type of exercise? Do you think that's the trend of the future when it comes to healthcare?
So I think it's the trend of the future for this reason. It's very hard to change people's behavior. And we've had programs in schools for physical fitness for decades and decades and decades. And yet the average physical activity in this country has remained the same. And so I think the goal is to have people not think of exercise as this thing that you have to do that's painful, you have to go to the gym, but really just, I think it's what you're suggesting, Adrienne, is just change your lifestyle so that more of your day is spent moving. And that can be gardening, that can be walking, that can be things that don't have the same kind of, I think, cognitive stress of exercising, going to the gym. So I think I almost think of it as like, we've kind of, we've given up and said, look, people aren't going to exercise. What else can we do? And the question is, how much of that is necessary to get these health benefits? And I think there's evidence that, an hour a day of just activity as opposed to sitting has this incremental benefit. So I think it's the way of the future, not because it's better, because it's what people hopefully will do.
I have another question from the chat, if you don't mind. Amin Cheikhi says, how do you reconcile the heterochronic parabiosis blood data vis-a-vis single intervention, such as clotho, for example?
Well, I think, so what the question is referring to is that, there are genes, and clotho is one of them, that are, called longevity genes. And so I don't think there's any inconsistency. I think that the potential for exercise to induce these so-called longevity genes that might be circulating or might be local, is exactly where we start. On the one hand, as we look in the blood, we might find proteins or metabolites that are completely unexpected, but we might find proteins or metabolites that are predicted in some ways from, decades of research on genes and longevity. So, and actually, we know that exercise changes the expression of clotho. So I think that, we can look at the known regulators of lifespan, essentially, and ask, are those some of the things that are mediating these health benefits of exercise?
So we have to wrap up, but there's one last comment I'd love you to make. We do not have on this conference behavioral scientists, but we will be doing that with regard to the Catalyst Institute web educations, webcasts, webinars. What do you feel that you can help behavioral scientists with and the public from what you're learning? Perhaps this compendium of your research can show the benefits strong enough. For example, the one area where America changed their habits was smoking. And that took a campaign of both push and pull. You think we may be able to still do that with regard to exercise despite the years of no change?
No.
No. No.
I don't mean to be pessimistic.
All right.
but I really think it's what they can do for us, because I think the information is there, and it's exactly what you said, again, is that people have known for decades and decades and decades that smoking is bad, and it took billions of dollars and a concerted effort from the government to start to bring that down a little at a time, and it's come down, but people still smoke, obviously. Exercise has not had quite the investment, but there really has been enormous the President's Council on Fitness to try and get people active, and it has not worked. I don't think, the reason why I was so negative, I don't think more information is going to matter. I think it really is, the behavioral scientists understanding why people make decisions they make, and then finding ways to, which I think starts, in school, changing behaviors from a very young age. I teach with my colleague Laura Carstensen. We teach a course at Stanford on aging and longevity to the undergraduates, and I always use an example. I always say, how many of you floss? And they all raise their hand. 100% raise their hands. Most people, my age, you have to remember to do it. And I think really there's this idea, if we start people very young, this is how life is supposed to be, and this is what you do. That's our best hope. So I think we probably can't help the behavioral scientists, but I think they can help us.
Wonderful, well said. Thank you so much. And we're going to have a very nice interlude in a second or two. Wonderful. And we will be continuing this with many webinars, many webcasts, just honing in on the importance of exercise in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. I'd love to take that course. I wonder if I could audit it.
You're welcome to sit in on it. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks.
enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Thank you.